Educating HG, The Narcissistic Psychopath at School, Part 6. Hello, I'm HG Tudor, and you're joining me as I take you back to my school days to help you understand more about the person that I am, to give you insight into the way that I behaved when I was being educated. My education has spanned primary school, secondary school, sixth form college, university, both at undergraduate and postgraduate levels. Of course, there have been other forms of education that I've received, but I'm today going to take you back to when I was at primary school. Yes, rolling back the years. My primary school was such that you entered through the main doors, and in front of you there was a long, long corridor. This corridor spanned the entire length of the school. Thus, at one end was the main entrance, and at the far end was another entrance exit. Immediately on your right, there was an open reception area, and through a door sat the school secretary and the headmaster's office. There were a number of occasions that I had to attend the headmaster's office. More about that in due course. All of the classrooms were down the left-hand side from this corridor. There were 7 of these classrooms. Further along, there was the staff room, various storage rooms, then an open area which also served as an impromptu classroom, and then either side of this impromptu classroom were 2 sets of double doors which led into the assembly hall, which also doubled as an area for physical education when it was wet and during the winter, and also where everybody dined. Further beyond this was some storage capacity, the school kitchens, another area which then eventually became a classroom. Back out onto that corridor. Each door led into one of the classrooms, ranging from the infants up to the juniors. And each classroom opened up onto the outside. Thus, the first 3 classrooms, which catered to the infants, opened up onto a tarmacked area, which was an area of playground with various markings on it for the children to play games, and then a field. This was the football field, scene of many a victory for your glorious narrator. The field ran the length of the school, and then there was another field on the opposite side and one behind the school as well. So it was well served by its greenery. On the opposite side, there was also a tarmacked area, which was where the netball courts were for the girls. This was my primary school. And I recall on one particular occasion, this was when I was a very young boy, that the way that it worked was that in the morning you studied, so you learnt to write and read, both of which I could do before I attended school. That you undertook some mathematics, that there were other things that you learned about. And then in the afternoon, it was more of a playtime, choosing time it was called, where you were able to choose something that you could play with. Because, of course, apparently we learnt through play as well. I certainly did, though I suspect it was not the kind of learning that my teacher at that juncture envisaged. My teacher was a blonde lady. I'll call her Miss S. She was quite attractive, and I can still picture her. I remember that she was quite busty, and even then as a young boy I was transfixed by her cleavage, as often, the buttons straining on her blouse, we were given an all too tempting look when she bent forward. But this isn't about the fixation that I might have had upon my teacher's bust back then. But on one particular occasion, that when the weather was decent enough, we were allowed outside and one could play with water, or there was a sandpit. and the sandpit was in a quite large plastic container which was set upon a standard on wheels, so it could be wheeled in and out of the classroom. It wasn't a fixed sandpit that the local dogs would come along and shit in, but rather would be moved in and out of the classroom. And I recall on this particular occasion that we were outside, and I suspect it was a sunny September day. There were a number of us playing outside. So there were 2 or 3 people around the water play. There were some others, I think, with a train track playing on the tarmac, and children dotted around enjoying a burst of autumnal sunshine. I was involved, as I said, with the sandpit, with another boy. We'll call him Wayne. Now, Wayne actually turned into being what was known as the cock of the class, not a cock as in certain somebody who would mess about, but being the hardest boy in the class. This was because he had a reputation for enjoying fighting, and the way that it worked would be that if you had a fight with someone who was who was ascertained at being a certain level in the hierarchy and beat them, you then took that position. Thus, if you decided that you were going to fight the 5th cock of the class and you won that fight, then you became 5th cock. Strange little hierarchy. Wayne, interestingly enough, was somebody that I met many years later on a return to this town. I recall that, of course, I'd moved on in life and was doing something completely different when I turned up in a rather flash red sports car. I'd pulled up on the high street, and as I exited the car with the then intimate partner primary source that I was seeing, I heard a voice say, "It's H.G. Tudor." I turned, and there was Wayne. I remember that when we were at school together, there wasn't too much difference between us in terms of size. I was a little taller than him, but now I towered over him. Here was the boy who was once the cock of the class, and in fairness, he and I never had any issues with one another. We actually got along, even though there was a considerable disparity, both in terms of my intelligence and what I would achieve compared to what he would achieve. I had heard from another classmate that I'd stayed in touch with that Wayne had turned into a smackhead at some point, although he appeared perhaps to have left those matters behind him, as he didn't show much sign of that when he stood before me. He saw me, and as I mentioned, I towered over him. He glanced at the vehicle and he said, "You've done well for yourself." I smiled. He said, "Hello, Wayne. What have you been up to then?" And again he said, "I always knew." He said, You've done well. I always knew you'd do well. You were the brainiest in our class." I nodded as I looked him up and down. Although he had not grown as much as I had, indeed, as I stood at 6'1", he looked like he stuck somewhere in the region of 5'8" or 5'9", but he was stooped over. Also, the way that he spoke, it was as if he was tugging at his forelock, that he recognised his better. He was quite deferent. It was interesting that the cockiness that he exhibited as a child, that spark, appeared to almost have been sucked out of him, perhaps beaten out of him. I didn't care to find out, but he certainly looked a shadow of the plucky young springbok that raced around those fields all those years ago. It was interesting to see the contrast between him as the cocky, supposedly hardest boy in the class, with this now almost quite timid figure, deferent, that was almost stooping before me, as if he realised that he had met his better and that it was important for him to show his respects. We had a simple enough conversation. He asked me what I was doing. I explained, albeit I didn't tell him the truth of it, for I couldn't tell him that, but I chose something which was of a similar level. He nodded, although I doubted he fully understood what that meant, I asked him what he was doing. He said a bit of this and that, some scaffolding from time to time. I nodded and realised, as it was all of those years ago, we had so little in common. "Well, pleasure to have seen you again, Wayne," I announced. "Must get on. Things to do, people to see." I jerked my head in the direction of the attractive, intimate part of Primary Source, who stood beside me. "Oh, yeah, don't let me keep you," he said, backing away, almost as if it was the case that he couldn't turn his back to an audience with the king. But that was years later, when we were both adults, and on that sunny September day, he and I were playing in the sandpit. We had some plastic spoons with which we were to dig the sand, and I remarked to Wayne, "Let's use these spoons and fire the sand at that group there." He looked at me, hesitant for a moment. I said, "Go on, fire the sand at them. It'll be a laugh." He scooped up some of the sand and pulled back the small plastic spoon, which enabled him to propel the sand so that it showered one of the girls who was playing nearby. She issued a shriek of alarm. He laughed. I smiled. "Do it again," I encouraged. Whilst I was tempted to pick up the spoon myself, I actually found it far more satisfying to direct Wayne to do this on my behalf. He had become the instrument of my will. Naturally, I didn't think that at the time. I simply thought it was good to make him do what I wanted. But as I look back upon this memory, plucking it from the depths of my mind, from the swirling darkness that resides there, it appears to me that what appealed was the fact that he was bending to my will, that I made him an instrument of mine. "Fire again," I urged him. His eyes lit up as he scooped up another spoonful of sand and fired it across at another set of girls. They issued another shriek as one of them caught it into her eyes and immediately started to cry. "Again," I urged him. Overcome with excitement and revelling in the fact that he was being able to pepper these individuals with sand fired from this spoon, he launched another broadside, this time at two boys who were playing at the side with the train. They leapt up in alarm and backed away. Of course, the noise, the crying girl, the shouts of those that were assaulted by Wayne and his plastic spoon of death-dealing sand had prompted the attention of Miss S. She emerged from the classroom. "What's going on out here?" she declared. She came over to the sand tray. "What are you two boys doing?" she demanded. Wayne was stood there, of course, guilty spoon in hand. I knew that at this point it was necessary for me to distance myself from him. I was not going to go so far as to say, "Wayne did it." Nobody likes a telltale. But instead I would utilise something else that I know that I had learned in order to ensure that I would be forgiven, or indeed not even blamed to begin with. The use of those big blue eyes. I turned and gave Miss S a plaintive look. I'd learnt this. I had seen it used by others and knew that this was an effective way to cause people to let me off the hook. I used it regularly with my father, with my siblings. It cut no mustard with my mother, though that was not to be surprised. But with Miss S, I immediately made my eyes as wide as I could possibly make them, and placed a look of sheer angelic innocence upon my face. I looked at her as if to say, "I don't understand what's happening. This is all alien to me. I would never behave in the suggested way." She looked at me, and then looked across at Wayne. A voice cried out, "Wayne did it." Already one of the other pupils had dobbed him in. "Wasn't me, miss," he said immediately, a knee-jerk reaction which I'm sure he had used many times at home when he was being chastised for naughty behaviour. "Come with me," she said, and immediately grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. "Ow!" he announced as he was roughly removed from the sandpit. He was taken indoors, made to stand in the corner and miss the rest of the choosing time, having to succumb to the boredom of staring at the wall, head bowed, placed in a position of shame. Meanwhile, I was able to continue with my play. The other children dusted themselves down. They said nothing about the fact that Wayne's actions had been at my urging and direction. And it gave me a sense of pleasure to have witnessed their reaction as a consequence of the way that he had behaved, entirely at my direction, and also the fact that I had got away with it. In the scheme of things, it was put down to simple naughtiness on the part of Wayne, but it showed the susceptibility of individuals, that I realised at an early age those that could be harnessed to do my doing, to undertake the expansion of my will. I hadn't stood there and thought, I know I'll bend Wayne to my will. I simply acted by deciding instinctively that he would do what I wanted him to do, that he would carry out what I wanted to happen, namely the interruption of the other children's play by being pelted with sand, and that I would find that amusing and entertaining to do so. And furthermore, that I was able to undertake this without any culpability on my part. I was very young when this happened. It is a distant memory, but one that looms large when I recall it, that I can picture with considerable detail the events, recalling what Wayne was wearing. I can see the position of the children in my mind's eye, the way that the sun fell upon their hair, the expression of Miss S., a woman who I've not seen in decades. It's all stored away, plucked like that grabber on a pier when I require the memory, and otherwise cast into oblivion, only brought back for the purposes of when I require it. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.